here's a quick word from our football educational partners over at the Scouting Academy.
Listen, we've said it all the time. If you love the analysis and you're passionate about football, then you really need to check out the Scouting Academy. Whether you're a football coach, aspiring writer, or even aspiring football agent, the Scouting Academy is really a perfect place for you to learn and develop your skills as an analyst. With curriculum that spans over 375 years of coaching and personnel experience, the Scouting Academy offers you a 16-week online course that you can tailor and build to meet your needs and your interests. Whether you're learning about wide receivers or defensive linemen, you can make the experience what you want it to be. Listen, I've said it to you on this podcast many times. I've spent my own money, my own time, and time away from my friends and family because I am just this passionate about this game. And the Scouting Academy is the place where I really feel like I've learned the most I've ever learned about the game of football. It's made me a better analyst. It's made me a better person in terms of the coaching I do on the field. I can't say enough great things about it. If you have any questions about the Scouting Academy, please don't hesitate to reach out to Dan Hatman on Twitter or reach out to the Scouting Academy online via email. I'm open to all questions as well. Heck, I'm still even a student there myself. Please don't hesitate to reach out. I really think that once you learn all the tools and gain the knowledge that they have to offer, I really think you're going to be absolutely excited about the game of football again.
This is the Saturday to Sunday Football Podcast.
This is where it all counts. This is why we're here. This is why each one of us are here.
And now, here's your host.
Welcome back to another edition of the Saturday to Sunday Football Podcast. I am Paul Perticchese, and thank you for joining us this evening. I am pleasured to have with me a guest this evening from NFL.com. You also know him as the man who's created Yards Created to evaluate the running back position, Mr. Graham Barfield. Graham, welcome to the Saturday to Sunday Football Podcast.
It's an honor to be here, man. I appreciate you having me on, and I'm excited to chop it up with you today, man.
Yeah, absolutely. So, obviously, I know draft season, real busy evaluating these running backs. Obviously, we are under a week and a half away now, almost a week away from the NFL draft. So a lot going on right now. So, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. And let's just kind of get right into it. This is the first time you've been on the Saturday to Sunday Football Podcast. So maybe just a little bit of background about Yards Created, what its purpose, what it's most useful for in terms of evaluating these positions to kind of get started.
Sure, yeah. Yards Created is a project that I started 4 years ago now. And it basically, I've just kept it to college only. And essentially, as we know, running back and offensive line play will never be truly independent on one another. But a couple years ago, I just came up with this idea to start charting plays on an individual basis and accrediting the yards that the running back is due and the yards blocked for him on each play. And I've kind of taken it a bunch of different avenues now. I chart missed tackles. I chart defenders in the box. I chart personnel packages. Obviously, I also chart passing down plays, receiving and routes run, and pass blocking too. So it's kind of become this like full snapshot, I guess. I just originally intended it to be rushing only, but now it's a full-on process. And it's a lot of fun to do every year.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's great stuff. It really paints a really good picture of these running backs, kind of letting you know what they do, where they're most successful, and really paints a good picture of them. And I think that's so important because, like you talk about, there's so much that goes into, a collegiate running back having success. It could be scheme, it could be offensive line, it could be, quarterback, skill position players that are drawing attention away from the defense. So the way you analyze it and break it down with Yards Created, I really think does a good job, of bringing to the forefront some of their areas of what they do well and those yards that they are creating and being able to make big plays. So I think it's fascinating stuff. The class as a whole this year, the running back group in general this year is very much a down year. We don't have that Saquon Barkley, that Christian McCaffrey, type players. We don't even, have somebody, like years past, Ezekiel Elliott, Leonard Fournette, at the top of the draft class. And most people think there might only be one guy even taken in round one, but even a little bit more big picture than that. Thoughts on the 2019 running back class in general?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mixed bag, in my opinion. I think it's a little bit all over the place. There's one guy at the top, Josh Jacobs, who I think does everything pretty well. But everyone else in this class has their warts and has their small little problems. And some of them are small and some of them are quite large and possibly career threatening. But I don't know, man. I think I've warmed like a little bit on this class the more that I've studied it. And maybe I'm just getting excited because the draft is close by. But all by and large, I mean, I've been doing this now for 4 years, and this is easily the weakest group. And hopefully this amazing receiver and tight end class that's coming out kind of balances out some of the misfits that we have with these running backs.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I do think there's some solid players that, again, running back is one of those positions at the NFL level that a lot of the success sometimes is dependent upon so many other factors,
right.
So I do think there's some guys that could see success at the next level, in addition to, Jacobs at the top and some other guys. Before we get into some of these players, again, just for people who might be a little bit unfamiliar with yards created, off the top of your head, doesn't have to be specifics. Mm-hmm. Who are some of the guys since you've been doing that maybe have tested out towards the better end of yards created? Was there any surprise guys that maybe tested out a lot better that the NFL didn't think as highly of, but have had success at the next level or more success than maybe what the media and the attention was giving them over these years?
Well, to be honest with you, I'm looking at them right now, the top 10 backs that I have over the last 4 years it's kind of a who's who and basically who you would expect. Joe Mixon in 2017 still leads the way in yards created per attempt. Darrell Henderson is second, actually. We'll get to him in a moment and maybe why he's second. Kenyon Drake performed very, very well in yards created in 2016. But that was just a very small sample. But the rest of the crop is Barkley, Elliott, Fournette, Kamara, Hunt, McCaffrey. There have definitely been a few guys like Kareem Hunt who have really, really popped that I've been significantly higher on than the NFL. I was pretty high on Kamara coming out too, but I was actually a little bit worried in the way that he was used. But yeah, I mean, it's identified Kareem Hunt. It identified Christian McCaffrey as a bell cow back when a lot of people didn't think he was a bell cow back. It's definitely, I mean, it's by no means a perfect process, but it's certainly illuminated, like you mentioned at the top, where these guys win and where they need to improve.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's really some fascinating stuff. I mean, especially about Kareem Hunt, and I also think Kenyon Drake, because Kenyon Drake was a guy that not a lot of people were very high on him. I know Matt and I here at Saturday to Sunday, we were pretty big fans of Kenyon Drake. We thought he was a guy who, warranted going in the top 100 picks. We liked his game at Alabama, but the consensus on him was a lot of people were really down on him. So it's interesting to hear that he was someone who tested out well in this, in your yards created, and when he's been given the opportunity at the NFL level, I think he has shown that ability to make something happen and be an impactful player. Now with a new, coaching staff in Miami, it'll be interesting to kind of see if he gets an opportunity to be a little bit more of a workhorse than he was last year, spending a lot of time there. So it's interesting. And then especially Kareem Hunt, another guy, fell to the third round. He had some people who liked him. A lot of people were on the fence about whether or not, they thought he was going to transition to the next level. So I think, just those two names in itself, in addition to all the who's who names, I think those are really illuminating that they did, test out well in this. And I think, it kind of shows, in some ways that the process is identifying some of those guys that maybe aren't being recognized by the consensus as much. So I think that's really interesting and unique. So let's take this to this year's class. We've already mentioned him a couple times, Josh Jacobs. Where did he kind of fall? Was he the one at the top of your rating, or was that, you mentioned Henderson? Did Henderson outdo him?
No, I mean, Darrell Henderson did create more yards on a per attempt basis, but just based on the whole profile, I think Jacobs is pretty easily my number one running back in this class. I've gone back and forth with a lot of really sharp people on Jacobs, and I've kind of found that a few have talked themselves out of Jacobs, and it's kind of been interesting to see him go from what I felt like maybe should have been a consensus RB1 to sort of not. But I'm sticking to my guns here. I think Josh Jacobs is a badass. I mean, Bama's offensive line was fantastic. They actually posted the second best score in yards blocked per attempt over the last 4 years. But don't get mistaken here. Jacobs is a very, very elusive and powerful runner who almost always churns out extra yards. He tied Christian McCaffrey for the 9th best score in missed tackles forced per attempt over the last 4 years. And he actually tied Saquon Barkley for the 3rd highest percentage of carries to create 5 or more yards over the last 4 years. Only Joe Mixon and Sony Michel have been better. So not only is he like a consistent grinder and someone who's popping off, consistent runs and also making defenders miss, he's a fantastic asset in the passing game. He averaged 2.4 yards per route run this last season. That was the 2nd best in the class behind Darrell Henderson. And he also leads the class in pass protection execution rate. I've seen a few people mention that Jacobs is a poor pass protector, but I did not see that at all. Not only just from like an objective standpoint, but from a subjective standpoint as well. I thought Jacobs was a very consistent pass protector and actually a plus pass protector. When you compare him to the college baseline over the last 4 years, I'm very, very interested to see where Jacobs would go. Before I got into yards created, I'll be honest here, Paul, I did not think he would go in the top 50, but now that I dove in and charted, I think it was 7 games, so it was like over 250 snaps. I'm kind of back in on Jacobs as maybe a late half, maybe back half of the first round pick.
Yeah, I mean, Jacobs is a guy, I know he's Maddenized RB1. You know, we've been kind of saying all year that in a weird way, like he seems to be like almost like a blend of Mark Ingram and Mark Ingram's former teammate, Kamara, who we mentioned. Like he has components of both of those guys. You talked about how effective he is in the passing game and ability to make people miss and make big plays. But at the same time, that physicality, that toughness, that grinding out approach is very much like a Mark Ingram. So like, I feel like he's kind of bringing a little bit of both of those guys and he's his own unique player, but he kind of has traits and similarities to both of those guys. And I think that's what makes him so intriguing. Right. You know, a 3-down player who can do a little bit of each of that stuff. You know, I think he warrants going somewhere in round 1. It's hard right now to find a particular landing spot, but, you know, maybe the Eagles, even though they just traded for Jordan Howard, you know, maybe the Ravens, even though they brought in Mark Ingram, a guy we're talking about, you know, but you start to kind of find maybe the Raiders. I think they're probably the one that makes the most sense with 2 picks in the 20s. Obviously they have the early one in the top 10 as well. You know, they don't know about Marshawn Lynch. He'd be a guy, you know, that I think would fit in really well there. So there's a couple spots in the 20s. If not, he could fall to the early part of round 2. And I mean, I think he really starts to kind of become a steal at that point. And going on before we move on to your point, yeah, it's a little baffling to see some people coming off of him. And I don't know if it's the market share people, the people that really like to see the elite level collegiate production. I don't know if it's the athleticism component where he didn't like blow the roof off his athletic testing when he finally, you know, got to do it at his pro day, or just, you know, the lack of, you know, what we saw from him. He's not a big time producer. He was playing, you know, committee approach there or whatever. Maybe it's any of them or all of them or part all of them, but I think the NFL is looking past all of that. I think they're seeing what you're seeing. I think they're seeing what I'm seeing, and I think they're seeing him as the clear tier 1 and then a break to me before we get to the next set of running backs. Because I think once you get to the next set of running backs, it's put him in a, you know, put him in a hat, shuffle him up, and you know, I think anybody's next 5 to 7 could be completely different. If you ask me, you, and 10 other people, I don't think there's a lot of consistency after him at the top. So I think he's a fascinating player. It's going to be fun to kind of see where he goes off the board next week. So you mentioned Henderson before. So why don't we go there next? Because he's such a unique player. To me, big play threat, you know, versatile to impact it in the receiving game as well as a big play threat in the run game. What do you think about Henderson?
Yeah, Darrell Henderson's he's kind of my guy in this class. He smashed yards created, actually posted, like I mentioned at the top, posted the 2nd best score in yards created per attempt over the last 4 years behind Joe Mixon. That is in fact due in large part though to Memphis's offensive climate and their offensive line. Memphis's run game is probably the most multiple I've charted over the last 4 years. And when I say multiple, it's just that they ran everything. I mean, they ran inside zone, they ran gap stuff, they ran man, they ran power. I mean, it was really a lot of fun. They ran counter, kind of diverse counter tray options that were really fun plays. But their offensive line really carried the way there. I mean, their offensive line is the best I've ever charted over the last 4 years. But again, this kind of comes down to like, Henderson's still doing a lot of explosive stuff on his own. 92% of his carries at Memphis were out of shotgun, and he finished third over the last 4 years in yards created per attempt out of shotgun. Only Dalvin Cook and Joe Mixon have been better. Saquon Barkley and Ezekiel Elliott round out the top four. So he's explosive on the ground, highly explosive through the air too. He actually leads the class in yards per route run at 2.8. But the thing is, while he's a great receiver, Memphis rarely asked him to pass block. He only had 2 pass blocking snaps on 195 snaps that I charted. So kind of interesting that Memphis didn't ask him to pass block. They really wanted to utilize him as a receiver, and they actually split him out from their formation. They detached him as a receiver out of the backfield on 23% of his routes at Memphis last year. I think Henderson checks a lot of boxes for me from just like an explosiveness standpoint on tape. Also, his athleticism at the combine definitely backs that up. The big thing that I come back to with him is he just ran through just massive Mack truck style holes at Memphis. So it's a little bit difficult. I think he's been difficult for people to evaluate based on that. But once you kind of roll it all up, you add up the explosiveness, you add up the receiving ability. I think he's kind of exactly what the NFL is looking for right now, a player who can handle 10 to 14 carries per game, see 5 or 6 targets, and hopefully be a pretty solid PPR asset for us in fantasy wherever he goes.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to like about his game. I could even see somebody saying, we mentioned Kenyon Drake before. I don't think Drake's ever going to be a guy that gets a heavy workload or a heavy volume in terms of carries, but he offers a lot in the pass game as well. Someone could look at a guy like Henderson and say, big play threat. We can use him 10 to 14 touches. We can use him how, maybe Miami 2 years ago really was using Kenyon Drake in a variety of ways. So I think that's interesting. And I'm so glad you brought it up and kind of talked through it, so I don't even have to kind of follow up the question. Is that's my biggest concern when I watched Henderson was hard to make sense sometimes of what he was doing and what was those gaping holes. Cause like, I remember when I first started watching his game and taking notes, it was like, those were as large holes I've seen a running back run through. The only one that even ever resembled that to me was when I watched Rashard Penny, his year coming out.
That's the same guy I thought about watching him too. Is Rashard Penny ran through some massive holes at San Diego State too.
And sometimes it's like, for the people who go a lot on the percentages and the college statistics, like it's hard for Rashard Penny to look bad when you're looking at those stats in San Diego State, and kind of like Henderson here. So I'm glad you kind of talked through like that being a component that, you kind of got to take into account, but at the same time, he's still doing, a lot of things in addition to just those plays when he had those gaping holes. But I do think that's why he makes up for a little bit of an interesting challenge for some people, very similar to when Penny was coming out as well, because those holes were just, it's almost stunning sometimes to see like the floodgates open, like almost like the defense is intentionally doing it. Like at the end of a game when you want to let the team score a touchdown, to go up 8 or something to, get the ball back. Like that's what it seemed like sometimes, this massive hole. So interesting. Obviously the level of competition probably has something to do with that, but, we can't knock him for where he played and how productive he was there. And I think that's kind of, what you're getting at.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's not his fault that Memphis's offense and their offensive line was really good. I mean, just once he got to the second level, you could tell just based on the angles the defenders were trying to get at with him, both safeties and linebackers, you could really tell the explosiveness he has because he makes those angles look just god awful because he's just so much faster and more explosive than the level of competition he played against.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's transition this to, I think, the guy who's probably aced the pre-draft process more than any of the eligible running backs I think it's Miles Sanders. I think he's a guy that maybe the NFL was higher on him, but in terms of perception, in terms of what you see on draft Twitter, I feel like Miles Sanders has made the biggest jump from the end of the college football season to where we are today, potentially being a second round pick, top 50 guy, definitely probably coming off the board no worse than round 3. How did Miles Sanders look when obviously, you only really focus on this year? This is a guy very limited before it, backing up Saquon Barkley. In the games that you watch of him from this past year, what do you think of Miles Sanders?
Yeah, obviously just has the 1 year as a starter at Penn State, which I think has thrown a little – I think it's kind of made people a little bit like come on board a little bit late. Obviously, he only has 276 carries over his Penn State career. I think Miles Sanders, I came into it maybe a little bit more excited for him. And then once I kind of got through the process and charting the games, I kind of came down just a little bit. He's 4th in the class behind Darrell Henderson, Bryce Love, and Josh Jacobs in yards created per attempt. It's not that he's not an explosive player. He's definitely, I think, a borderline, almost bell cow worthy back. He was consistently creating yards on his own. 32% of his carries created 5 or more yards. That's the second best rate in the class. And he's actually tied Josh Jacobs too for the second best score in missed tackles forced per attempt by elusiveness alone. That being said, I did feel like there was times watching Sanders just from a subjective standpoint here, where I felt like Sanders kind of didn't necessarily either trust the blocking or know where to go on specific plays. And he would kind of float and bounce and be a little hesitant behind the line of scrimmage. And Paul, I think that's just simply reps. I just genuinely think Sanders needs more time to kind of get used to running behind an offensive line and playing at a college, or like a game level type speed, because he just did not have the reps at Penn State to do it because he played behind Saquon Barkley, who happens to be amazing. I kind of came down a little wishy-washy on Sanders too, a little bit in his pass protection and as a receiver. But again, I'm willing to kind of give that pass just because he got hurt mid-season, and also we only have 13 games to scout him from. I think most people have kind of come down on Sanders as either their RB2 or RB3. I've seen him as high as the number 1 running back in a few spots, and I think that's a little bit outlandish, but yeah, I'm with you. I have kind of a 3rd, 4th round grade on Sanders, and I think he'll likely end up going in that range. Yeah,
I mean, Sanders is interesting, and some of that indecisiveness that I think you talked about, I think part of it is repetition, and also part of it is, I think sometimes, especially playing behind Saquon Barkley, you sometimes see another guy doing certain things, and, whether it's trying to emulate them, wanting to emulate them, I do wonder if sometimes he tried at times, or even this year, tried to be a little bit Barkley-esque. He just doesn't have it in his toolbox.
But Barkley can get away with some of the negative gains and just kind of the BS behind the line of scrimmage because he's a Greek god of an athlete.
Absolutely.
Miles Sanders is not a Greek god and an athlete. He's a good athlete, but he's not a Greek god.
Yeah, just out of curiosity, because you didn't mention it, I know it's usually one of the main things people bring up with Miles Sanders. In your full profile, when you do this, obviously you're looking, do you take ball security, fumbles into any way, shape, or form? Because that tends to be the biggest knock that I've heard on Miles Sanders is concerns about ball security. Is that something that you kind of include in any way in your profile, or you're not really focusing on that when you're watching the film of these guys?
I'll be honest, unless it is a strict, oh my God, this guy has terrible technique, I never really consider it, just because I think fumbles, just like drops, are pretty random. Unless you have just awful technique and for drops, your timing with the quarterback is bad, whatever the case may be. I rarely consider fumbles in my analysis just because they're random and some of the times they lack context. Sony Michel was a habitual fumbler at Georgia and then didn't fumble at all last year. It's just, and he plays for the Patriots, by the way. It's one of those things where I just don't really consider it at all in my analysis, unless it's just an obvious case where a player has bad technique or it's just very apparent on tape or through the data.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I kind of use that too. Like, I don't really knock guys for if they have some fumbles. I think it is very random. We saw Sony Michel, and he went to, of all places, like you said, the Patriots and Bill Belichick, who's notorious for benching people who do fumble. So clearly they didn't look at him.
I don't know. I personally think Bill Belichick just hated Stephen Ridley because Stephen Ridley wasn't good.
that is very possible. I guess we'll find out if Sony Michel ever fumbles like once or twice, like early in the game. Do we see him the rest of the game or not? So let's keep this going, and I'll bring up two guys because I think they're very similar, and you can go through each one, or we, in between. I'll probably pose a question, and then we can hit on the other guy. But I think David Montgomery and Damien Harris they have some similarities in terms of play style, in terms of, physicality, toughness, not guys who are going to be elite level athletes, not guys who, have this amazing, I think, burst or speed, or long speed. Did they come out similarly when you put them through yards created? Did one, kind of stand above the other?
I definitely agree with you just from a trait standpoint that both Harris and Montgomery have very lackluster NFL burst and long speed. Now, long speed, home run speed is great to have, but it's not something that I'm like just trying to identify. I mean, it's just so rare for a running back, one, to have home run speed, and two, be able to use it, just because, 20 to 25 plus yard runs in the NFL in terms of percentage of your carries is just so low. I'll start with Montgomery. I think Montgomery will get away a little bit with his lack of burst just because his feet and power are so good. I mean, he leads the class in missed tackles forced per attempt. But I think Montgomery is best used off tackle when he can use his elusiveness and power to beat linebackers and defensive backs. Montgomery really struggled on inside carries in his yards created sample, was well below average in terms of yards created per attempt when he went in between the tackles. But like I mentioned, because he can use that elusiveness and his kind of feet and wiggle to beat defenders off tackle, he was very good on outside carries. Montgomery is also one of the few guys in this class who showed receiving chops consistently over the last 2 years. I believe he caught nearly 50 balls over the last 2 years, and he was pretty, I mean, sometimes with these guys, Paul, I'll get asked about pass protection. It's kind of like most college running backs suck at pass protection. I won't say David Montgomery was bad. He definitely needed a little bit of help, but almost everyone does there in that aspect. I'll go ahead and flip over to Damien Harris. I don't want to be too negative here, but I really think Damien Harris is almost a borderline NFL caliber running back. I came away I'm just not impressed at all in terms of where he wins or frankly where he does not win. He posted the second worst score in yards created per attempt over the last 4 years. Also the second worst score in missed tackles forced per attempt. And he had the fourth worst score in pass protection. I just kind of don't know where to hang my hat with Damien Harris. I know he was someone that a lot of people were kind of excited for coming out of 2017 and into his final year, but Josh Jacobs just completely blew him away in terms of his traits and overall NFL caliber. I read where Harris kind of dealt with injuries and played through injuries last season, but he really struggled to create yards on his own behind a fantastic offensive line, and that's just something Josh Jacobs did routinely. I'll be interested to see where Harris goes, just because he does have that pedigree as an Alabama back, and he did split carries with Josh Jacobs. But I don't think Montgomery and Harris are particularly close for me.
Yeah, and listen, Montgomery for me is my RB4, and that's keeping in somebody who barely played this year just because going back to his film a year before, I love his game. So Montgomery's number 4 for me. Harris is a little bit further down. It's going to be interesting because I do think, like you said, the pedigree, Alabama, 5-star recruit, like that, some of that stuff really does kind of, give the leash a little bit longer on some of these prospects. Just like when they get drafted, draft capital kind of impacts the leash tremendously at the NFL level. Star recruit number and what college and what people think about them early on in their collegiate career sometimes does carry and hold a lot of weight, maybe more than it should. And Harris is one of those guys who I was stunned when he went back to school last year. And I thought he went back and he looked at an opportunity as maybe to be the guy. And then Josh Jacobs basically becomes the guy generating a lot more buzz and attention there. So Harris is kind of one of those guys who, like, I think he's just pretty average at most things, but like I struggle to find an area where he really excels. He is above anyone else.
He is the Paul Perkins of this class, in my opinion. He's like, the Paul Perkins of this class.
Yeah, and Perkins had the name brand that people really liked. And I remember I'm a Giants fan. I remember when the Giants drafted him, I thought he was a very average running back at best. But I remember, seeing some people, whether it's on Twitter or even the media, like who covers the draft, they were really selling him up. And I was like, I think that's more name brand and statistics. And in terms of traits and skill level, I'm not really seeing it. And everyone kind of looked at it as like, he's the next future starting Giants running back, 5th round steal. And I never really thought Perkins had a calling card. And that's very much how I kind of feel about Damien Harris. And in this class, maybe he is somewhere in that 5 to 7 range. But I think that's a little bit more of the class, more so than his individual talent level. If he was in last year's class, he'd probably be most people like 10 or something, or maybe less than that. Of all the guys that went last year, he'd be way behind Kerryon Johnson, I think, and obviously Nick Chubb and all those guys. So I think that's part of it, which is really interesting. So let's move on from there. A couple other guys I want to pick your brain about. Let's start with, if Miles Sanders is the guy that I think has, I'll say, won the pre-draft process or generated the most buzz from when the season ended to where we are now, I think the guy that has probably seen the questions arise the most and more concerns be brought to the forefront is Devin Singletary at a Florida Atlantic. Obviously, elite level production, touchdown numbers, all that stuff. There was a lot of Shady McCoy comps being thrown by really reputable guys in the industry who cover these. And then he goes to the combine, and I can't remember a guy being hyped up as much to do as poorly at the combine as Devin Singletary. What do you think about Singletary? How does that even come into your focus when you're thinking about the full profile for these guys at just how poor he tested out?
Athletic testing definitely matters. I will say LaShawn McCoy was also a notoriously poor tester, but not as nearly as bad as Devin Singletary. McCoy's 40 time wasn't fantastic, but he was very, very elite in his agility drills. It's just weird, man. Like, Devin Singletary is 5'7", 200 pounds. You hear that and you're like, oh, he's this like kind of speed elusive guy. And he's just not. He wins through power. Which is just bizarre. And it's just not something that's going to transfer to the NFL level when you're 5'7" and 200 pounds, especially when you have a 15th percentile weight adjusted speed score. That said, I still think Singletary has, he's going to be very landing spot dependent, is what I'll say. We'll see where he goes in about a week. He ran behind just a brutal offensive line at FAU. They were the worst in class in terms of yards blocked per attempt. Their interior offensive line was just an absolute nightmare most plays. They averaged just 0.69 yards blocked per attempt on any carry in between the tackles. That's the 5th worst I've charted over the last 4 years. But you kind of mentioned it. It's kind of a non-starter with Singletary, right? He's 5'7", 200 pounds, and he's a non-athlete. The production is fantastic, and he earned a lot of that production because, he was the focal point of an FAU offense that didn't play a ton of very heavy competition. That said, I kind of have like a 4th or 5th round grade on Singletary based on yards created and his athletic profile. The production, like you mentioned, is just out of this world. He had like, how many touchdowns did he score total? Like 65 or 70 over his career?
It's just mind-boggling.
It was mind-blowing. But yeah, Singletary to me, he wins through power, and while that can work at FAU, the lack of long speed and truly elite elusiveness, I think, is really going to hold him back at the next level.
Yeah, and then correct me if I'm wrong, but like he probably didn't test out well in terms of his receiving components too, right? That's not really a part of his game. Did he show more in when you put him through? Like I know you mentioned Henderson before really showed out well. Singletary is, again, when you see that size, you see that stature. If he was a prolific receiving back with that. I think that would maybe make up for some of this other stuff. And you mentioned it before. I never thought he had long speed when I watched his college film, but I did think the change of direction drills were going to be pretty good at the combine. I think that was the area that probably surprised me the most. And this is when sometimes level of competition does matter. He might have looked a lot quicker and better play speed and more agile against the guys that, let's be honest, most of those guys are not going to be playing on Sundays, the guys he was playing against. And that's why sometimes level of competition does really mean a lot, because sometimes your eyes could lie a little bit to you. And I think Singletary, while yes, I think he's better than what his combine showed, I do think the combine brought to the forthright that maybe what we were watching at times on film was a little bit misleading based on what he was doing against the people that he was doing it against, if that makes sense.
It does. And to go back to your point really quick too about his ability in the pass game, he's last in the class in receiving yards gained per route run, but he only saw like 14 targets last season. FAU just did not throw the ball to him that often, but I mean, his pass protection execution rate is just 70%. That's well below average. The average is around 78% over the last 4 years. I mean, he's just a pint-sized back who wins through power, and he's a non-athlete. I mean, I wanted to really like Devin Singletary just because FAU's offensive line was so brutal, and he is really good in terms of creating, I think, in kind of for the lack of a better word, just in a crowded backfield because their offensive line was terrible. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of red flags around his profile that really have me concerned.
Yeah, I think you said, I think Ford's fifth round is probably where he's going to come off the board. But I feel like it's going to be interesting to see like where he gets taken and what's already on the roster, because like you try to say like, okay, this is going to be his role when he gets there, but it's not like change of pace, explosive back because he doesn't have that speed component. It's not third down receiving back because he's not good in pass protection, and he hasn't really shown anything against a lower level of competition that he could be impactful in the receiving game. So it's like, what is his role going to be? He's not going to be drafted to be a bell cow running back. So is he going to just be drafted to be like a backup early down replacement for your starter when you want to give him a rest? You know, that's tough to think that's going to transition to fantasy football, and unless a whole lot of things break right on depth charts and stuff like that. So he's an interesting one, and it's going to be interesting because I know there's a lot of people who are big fans of him, who've had him in their top 5, top 3, top 6, whatever the case may be. And again, he's somewhere in I think he's like 7 or 8 for me. So again, it just kind of is the class more so than his overall talent level. But I don't see a way for him to be a super impactful player, you know, early on and maybe ever at the NFL, just because of what we were just talking about. So let's close out the night with a guy who, if he would have came out last year, I think the narrative around this player would have been very, very different. He surprised everybody by going back to school. I think I saw something on Pat to the Draft that he ended up getting he finished off his degree that he wanted at Stanford, and that's Bryce Love. Obviously, you know, a Heisman finalist last year, comes back this year, not nearly as explosive at times. The team is not as good. Then he suffers an injury. Bryce Love, first question before we even get them, break him down. When you watch a guy like Bryce Love, do you just watch his 2018 film, or do you go back and watch anything from his year where he was just absolutely fantastic?
Yeah, I did that. I didn't want to be biased towards either one, so I ended up charting 3 games from his nearly Heisman year in 2017, and I charted 3 more from this last year, so I got 6 in total. I mean, I'll be honest, man, if Bryce Love were fully healthy and if I knew his ankles were okay, if I knew his knee was all right, he would be my RB2 in this class. Again, you mentioned it a few times, and it's a great way to kind of sum up this class. It truly is because of the class. I mean, Devin Singletary will be my RB6 or RB7 in that same range as you, but like if I were to re-rank him compared to the last 2 classes, I mean, he wouldn't even be in the top 15. Bryce Love, I do think, has that type of caliber to actually be a high-end running back in the NFL who constantly created on his own at Stanford. Stanford's offensive line really has kind of fallen apart over the last years. They were fantastic with Christian McCaffrey in 2017, but over the last years, they have definitely kind of regressed. Actually, they're second worst in the class in terms of yards blocked per attempt, but that just didn't matter for Bryce Love because he's just got so much natural explosiveness and power in his legs. He created 5.5 yards per attempt on all of his under center carries. And this matters because Stanford's offense was predicated with having the quarterback under center. 64% of Love's total carries came with the quarterback under center, and he created 5.6 yards per attempt with the quarterback under center. Only Leonard Fournette has been better over the last 4 years. Love also had to face a ton of 8-man boxes just because of the way Stanford's offense is designed. He faced 8 or more men in the box on 70% of his carries with the quarterback under center. He saw 8 or more defenders in the box on 48% of his carries in general, which is by far the highest rate in the class. The biggest concerns, man, are very simple with Love. It's just where are we at with his medicals? He dealt with an ankle injury in 2017, hurt his ankle against Notre Dame in 2018, and then we all know he popped his ACL in late December. That's just information that only NFL teams will have, and we'll just have to see where Love comes out in his rehabilitation process. I mean, he's only like 4 months in right now. I am very, very interested to see where he goes in day 2 or most likely day 3. But yeah, man, I want to see 2 or 3 years of a healthy Bryce Love at the NFL on a rookie contract where he can just ball out and hopefully provide a few decent fantasy seasons for us. But the ankle and knee problems are obviously very real and very concerning.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly, I think Bryce Love, and I'll just mention his name, I think Bryce Love and I think Rodney Anderson are the 2 running backs that could really have changed the narrative of this
wild
class.
Cards. They're the wild cards in this class.
Because Anderson was the guy I was talking about before. On skill alone, he's my number 2. On skill and film eval only, he's my number 2 running back if he was completely healthy when I watched his film from last year. Obviously, the medical red flags are through the roof. Anderson's basically been injured every single year but one. And that 1 year he was playing alongside Baker Mayfield in an all-time great offense. But I really do think Anderson and Love are 2 guys that could easily, if the medicals all of a sudden just magically get better and all of a sudden they don't suffer health issues at the next level, I think those guys with Josh Jacobs could easily amount to being the 3 most impactful players at the next level. Because I do think their skill and their talent alone really is unique. There is those calling cards of what you see when you watch those guys. And, I think right now, I think Jacobs, I think Anderson would be being talked about very similar to Jacobs as a 3-down player who can win in a variety of ways. But he just is such a concern medically, and we don't know anything about it. And I always come back to, and I've said it on here, if he goes, even Bryce Love will put them in the search. If he goes late round 3, I think the NFL thinks pretty highly of the medicals, and I think they're feeling pretty good, all things considered, with how deep of a class this is in terms of really good, strong offensive line group, great defensive group, especially for the rushers and the D line. And if all of a sudden Anderson or Love go before night 2 ends, I think that speaks volumes on teams that really must be feeling pretty good about their medicals. Or even right at the top of round 4, I'd be okay with, to be honest with you, because I do think there's not going to be a lot of running backs that go. I mean, in my draft projections notebook right now, I think I have 5, maybe 6 running backs going off the board in the top 102 picks, which is the first 3 rounds. And even that 5th or 6th one is very debatable. So I don't think a lot of running backs are coming off the board the first 3 rounds. So even if it's the top of the 4th round, I think it'll speak volumes about, what the NFL thinks medically about them. But if they fall to like round 6, I think that's a sign right there that the medical flags are really high. The doctors are a little bit concerned. So I think 4 or 5 is probably where I expect them to come off the board. I hope it's more 4 because I do really like both these guys. And again, we talked about it before. Draft capital is a real thing, just like star value at college, it kind of holds the leash a little bit longer in terms of opportunity. So I hope they end up somewhere where there's some draft capital attached to these guys, because I do think they're both impactful players, or could be impactful players. So it was nice to hear Bryce Love talked up a little bit, because I feel like he's a guy that not a lot of people are talking about him. And I think he's going under the radar a little bit. So, Graham, this was fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me. This was a lot of fun. Just let the audience know where they can find you on Twitter, where they can find your work, anything else you're working on. You kind of want to let people know what you're doing.
Sure, man. Thank you so much for having me on. This was a lot of fun. You and I pretty much, it sounds like we see this class the same way. I mean, Rodney Anderson dealt with a couple hard luck injuries. Bryce Love's had injury issues. I mean, it sounds like we see a lot of the same things on tape. So that was really cool to hear, man, because I think you know what you're talking about. But yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Graham Barfield. Find me on the NFL.coms. I have a yards created class breakdown coming out after the draft. We'll see where Rodney Anderson goes. Hopefully we have a few wild cards and surprises because this group is just not that great. But yeah, other than that, I mean, that's it.
Yeah. So again, guys, make sure you're checking out all that stuff. Make sure you're following him on Twitter. Excellent job. As always, I know he was just recently on the Roto World podcast with Josh Norris. So, if you have not had a chance to listen to that also, I highly recommend getting over there, and checking that out as well. So on behalf of Graham, on behalf of myself, on behalf of Matt, and our sound and tech engineer, David Nicano, thank you for joining us, and we look forward next time taking you from Saturday to Sunday.